I never thought a fence could start a war with an entire HOA. But apparently, when you own 40 acres of rural land surrounded by an HOA development, a simple fence can become a very expensive argument. My name is Daniel Carter, and my property sits just outside a growing suburban community in Texas. 40 acres, open pasture, a private gravel driveway, a small barn, and one long wooden fence that had been standing along the edge of my property for years. I didn't build it to cause trouble. I built it because I wanted to keep my cattle in, keep strangers out, and clearly mark where my land ended. Simple. At least, that's what I thought. Then one Monday morning, I found an envelope taped to my front gate. It wasn't from the county. It wasn't from the sheriff. It was from the HOA. Inside was an official-looking notice ordering me to remove my fence within 14 days. The reason? According to the HOA board, my fence was blocking a community access road. I actually laughed when I read it, because there was one small problem. That road wasn't a community road. It was my driveway, and according to my property records, the land underneath it belonged to me. I called the HOA office. A woman named Karen answered. She sounded extremely confident. Mr. Carter, your property is adjacent to the community, and our records indicate that residents have a right to use that access. I asked her to send me those records. She said the board had already reviewed everything. I asked for the legal document proving the HOA had an easement. She went silent. Then she said, "You need to cooperate before this becomes a bigger issue." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. They didn't have the document. They had an assumption, and they were hoping I wouldn't challenge it. So I didn't argue. I simply told her, "Send me everything in writing." 3 days later, another letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. The HOA claimed my fence interfered with emergency access and demanded that I remove it immediately. They even threatened fines. $500. Then another $500. Then daily penalties until the fence was gone. I looked at that letter and couldn't help but wonder how an HOA that didn't own my property believed it could fine me for protecting it. But I still didn't touch the fence. Instead, I contacted the county records office. And that's when things got interesting. The original property survey showed my boundary line running directly along the fence. There was no HOA easement, no public access road, no shared driveway, nothing. The road the HOA was talking about had once been a private ranch route. Over the years, the neighborhood had grown around it. Residents started using it. Then somebody apparently decided that because people had been using it for years, they must have a legal right to keep using it. But convenience doesn't create ownership, and habit doesn't create an easement. Still, the HOA wasn't backing down. One Saturday morning, I heard trucks coming up the gravel road. I walked outside. 3 HOA representatives were standing near my fence, and behind them was a contractor with a trailer full of tools. I asked what they were doing. The HOA president pointed at my fence. "We're here to remove the obstruction." I told them they were trespassing. She said, "This is a community access route." I pulled out my phone and started recording. Then she made the mistake that changed everything. She told the contractor to start cutting. The contractor reached for the fence. I stepped between him and the gate. "Touch it," I said, "and you're going to have a problem." The HOA president threatened to call the police. I told her, "Go ahead." And she did. About 15 minutes later, a sheriff's SUV came rolling down the road. Everyone suddenly got quiet. The deputy stepped out and asked what was happening. The HOA president immediately started talking. She claimed I was blocking a public access road. She claimed residents had been using it for years. And she handed the deputy a copy of the HOA notice as if it were a court order. The deputy looked at it. Then he looked at me. "Do you own this property?" I handed him my deed and the county survey. He studied both documents. Then he walked over to the fence. He looked at the boundary markers. He looked back at the HOA representatives. And finally, he said something nobody there expected. "You're not removing this fence." The HOA president protested. "But our residents have access." The deputy shook his head. "That's a civil property dispute. You don't get to tear down someone's fence because you believe you have a right to the land." Then he pointed toward the contractor. "Pack up." The contractor didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, the trucks were leaving. The HOA president stayed behind. Furious, she told the deputy she would take this to court. He simply replied, "That's your option." Then he looked at me. "Until there's a court order saying otherwise, don't let anyone remove your fence." I thanked him and watched the HOA convoy disappear down my driveway. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, the HOA finally hired an attorney, and after reviewing the county records, something became very clear. They couldn't prove they owned the road. They couldn't prove they had an easement. And they couldn't prove they had any authority over my 40 acres. The demand stopped. The threat stopped. And most importantly, nobody touched my fence again. Today, that same fence is still standing. The HOA still has its roads, its sidewalks, its neighborhood rules, but my 40 acres remain mine. And every time I drive past that fence, I remember one simple lesson. An HOA can make rules for the property it actually controls. But confidence isn't ownership. A threatening letter isn't a court order. And when somebody tries to take control of your land without proving they have a right, sometimes all it takes is one sheriff who knows the difference. If you enjoyed this HOA story, like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.